Imagine yourself drifting back through time, carried on the quiet rhythm of centuries, to a Europe in the early 1300s. The world you would find there is one of deep routine, steady traditions, and the comforting patterns of life as it had been for generations. It was not a perfect world, far from it, yet to those who lived in, the sounds, the sights, and the rhythms of daily life felt timeless, as though nothing could ever truly change. The morning would begin with the crowing of roosters in the countryside. Farmers rose before the first light, stepping into fields still wet with dew. The land was everything to them, their livelihood, their anchor. They tilled soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowed seeds by hand, and prayed that the rains would come in their season. Children helped with chores, fetching water from wells, tending goats and sheep, or gathering firewood for the day's cooking. As the sun rose higher, villages slowly stirred. The smell of fresh bread baked in stone ovens drifted through the air. Simple meals, porridge, coarse loaves, maybe a little cheese, were shared before the day's work pulled each member of the household away again. In the distance, church bells began to toll, their echoes rolling across hills and valleys. Those bells measured life itself. They called the faithful to morning prayers, rang out at noon, and tolled solemnly for the dead when the time came. In towns, life was more bustling, though never overwhelming by our modern standards. Narrow, winding streets echoed with the sound of wooden wheels bumping across cobblestones. Shopkeepers lifted shutters and swept out dust as apprentices hurried about their master's errands. A blacksmith's hammer struck iron in a steady rhythm, sparks flying as he shaped horseshoes and tools. Candle makers, weavers, coopers, and butchers all played their part in the fabric of daily life. Markets were the heartbeat of these towns. Farmers brought baskets of apples and cabbages from surrounding fields. Fishermen laid out their catch of the day, the sharp scent of salt water clinging to their nets. Merchants shouted prices, bargaining with housewives who weighed each coin carefully. Children ran between stalls, laughing as they clutched tiny sweet treats when they could afford them. The market square was alive with color, boats of dyed cloth, stacks of pottery, and the gleam of metal goods. And then, as evening approached, the rhythm slowed again. Fires were lit in hearths, and the glow of candles flickered against wooden beams and plastered walls. Families gathered for their main meal, often simple stews of grains, beans, or whatever meat was available. Stories were told by firelight, tales of saints and kings, of heroes and fools, of wonders far away. These stories bound communities together, reminding them of their place in the larger world. Beyond these villages and towns lay castles and monasteries. Castles, perched on hills or guarding river crossings, stood as symbols of authority. Lords and knights lived within their walls, training for war, but also overseeing the land that supported them. Monasteries, by contrast, were places of learning, devotion, and silence. Monks rose in the stillness before dawn, their chants rising softly in candlelit chapels. They copied manuscripts by hand, tended gardens, and cared for the poor. Their presence gave structure and a sense of the eternal to the lives of ordinary people. For most, faith was inseparable from daily existence. Life was hard, filled with uncertainty, crop failures, harsh winters, or sudden sickness, but the church provided meaning and comfort. Holy days punctuated the calendar with festivals, feasts, and processions. The ringing of church bells was not just sound, it was reassurance, a constant reminder that God was present in every moment. And yet, this was also a time of change. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before. Ships with tall masts crowded Mediterranean ports, carrying grain from Egypt, spices from the East, silks from China, and wool from England. Caravans crossed deserts and mountains, connecting distant lands through commerce. Ideas traveled along these same paths. Scientific texts, religious debates, and artistic inspirations blending from one culture into another. Kings and princes maneuvered for power, raising armies and forging alliances. Wars flared between kingdoms, and borders shifted with victories and defeats. But for the average man or woman, these struggles of the mighty felt distant. What mattered most were the small certainties: a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, or the return of a loved one from pilgrimage or service. There was hardship, yes, famine, poverty, and the ever-present risks of illness. But these difficulties were woven into the fabric of life, endured with patience, faith, and the hope of better days. People laughed, worked, loved, and dreamed, just as we do now. If you had walked through a village at dusk, you might have seen neighbors leaning against doorways, sharing quiet conversation after a long day. The air filled with the smell of smoke from hearth fires and the gentle sound of animals settling in for the night. Beyond the village, the fields stretched into the distance, darkening under a sky thick with stars. It was a world that seemed stable and unchanging, a world of stone walls and wooden beams, of prayers whispered in the dark, of bells echoing across valleys. It was a world where tomorrow looked much like today, and where the future seemed certain. No one could know that just beyond the horizon, something unimaginable was stirring. An invisible shadow was making its way along the same trade routes that carried silks and spices. It traveled with sailors and merchants, hidden in cargo, unnoticed in the rush of daily life. And soon, this shadow would reach Europe's shores. But for now, as candles burned low and villagers drifted to sleep, the world was at peace in its own way. A world before the silence. A world unaware of the storm about to come. The world of the 14th century was more connected than ever. Across mountains, deserts, and seas, invisible threads bound distant lands together. Merchants, pilgrims, and sailors carried goods, stories, and hopes from one place to another, weaving a fabric of trade that stretched from China and India to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. If you had walked through one of these ports, the scene would have seemed alive with promise. In Venice, sails dotted the lagoon like white wings. In Constantinople, ships crowded the harbors with tall masts, their ropes creaking gently in the wind. Crates were unloaded, filled with spices that perfumed the air, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, treasures from lands far beyond the horizon. Alongside them came silks shimmering with colors rarely seen in Europe, and ceramics painted with intricate designs. But among the treasures were stowaways unseen. Small, common, almost invisible, rats crept through the shadows of cargo holds, fleas clinging to their fur. These humble creatures, unnoticed amid the wealth of empires, carried with them something that no one could have imagined. Within their blood stirred a sickness ancient and deadly, a sickness waiting quietly for its chance. In the East, whispers had already begun. Travelers spoke of strange deaths in distant lands, of villages struck down so suddenly that work in the fields lay abandoned. Caravan masters on the Silk Road exchanged cautious stories, but few could be sure of the truth. Rumors were like smoke, hard to hold, easy to dismiss. Life went on, as it always did.
Yet the trade routes themselves, those lifelines of wealth and survival, were also pathways for something darker. From the steppes of Central Asia to the markets of the Middle East, goods passed hand to hand, and with them, so too did the unseen shadow. At first no one noticed. A fever here, a sudden death there. Merchants fell ill after long journeys, but exhaustion and hunger were familiar companions of travel. Few suspected that something far more sinister was spreading silently among them. In the port of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea, whispers turned into fear. This bustling trading outpost, where Genoese merchants met caravans from the east, became one of the first places where the storm revealed itself. Accounts tell of a Mongol army laying siege to the city, their ranks struck down by a mysterious sickness. In desperation, or perhaps vengeance, they hurled the bodies of the dead over the city walls. Panic spread within, as townspeople fell ill, their bodies marked with swelling and fever. From there, the whispers began to gather strength. Sailors returning from Kaffa carried stories of the pestilence, though many of them would never live to tell those tales. Ships became floating coffins, drifting toward ports across the Mediterranean. And yet, when they arrived, no one knew. No one understood what lay hidden in the dark corners of the cargo hold, in the soft fur of the rats, or in the bites of tiny fleas. The sea winds carried more than the smell of salt and tar. They carried the quiet beginnings of a catastrophe that would sweep across continents. Each ship that docked brought goods and treasures that delighted buyers, but also carried an invisible passenger. Each caravan that reached a new market bore not only silks and spices, but the seeds of something that could not be traded away. And still, daily life continued. Dock workers unloaded barrels of grain. Women haggled for fresh fish. Priests blessed sailors before long voyages. Children played on the wharves, chasing gulls into the waves. The world seemed normal, alive, full of the same routines that had existed for centuries. The whispers of sickness seemed far away, belonging to someone else's land, someone else's misfortune. But the trade winds did not stop. Ships sailed on, caravans trudged forward, and with every passing day, the shadow crept closer. It moved silently, patiently, without warning and without mercy. The stage was set, though no one yet knew it. Europe, with its villages and towns, its cathedrals and castles, was still at peace in its own rhythm. But carried quietly across the waters and the roads of trade, a new story was approaching, a story that would change everything. The whispers were growing. The winds carried them farther, and soon those whispers would be heard not as rumors, but as reality. Long before the Black Death reached Europe's shores, its quiet shadow had already fallen across distant lands. To trace its steps, we must travel eastward, beyond the Black Sea, into the vast stretches of Asia, where trade routes crisscrossed deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys. It was here, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, that the sickness began its long and terrible journey. The Mongols had built a world unlike any seen before. From the forests of Russia to the plains of China, from Persia to the edges of India, their empire tied together countless peoples and lands. Their riders could travel across endless steppes, stopping at way stations where fresh horses waited, carrying messages faster than ever before. Merchants used these same routes, moving silks, spices, and precious stones across a network that made the world feel smaller, more connected. But the very roads that carried wealth and ideas also carried danger. Somewhere along these paths, historians still debate exactly where, the plague was born. Some suggest the dry steppes of Central Asia, where rodents burrowed in the earth, carrying within them a tiny, invisible killer. The fleas that lived on them, once disturbed by trade caravans or armies on the move, began to seek new hosts. Rats, traveling in wagons and ships, carried the fleas farther still. And so, what had once been a sickness of the wild slowly moved into the heart of human society. The first shadows were not always recognized for what they were. A village struck down suddenly, a caravan that never reached its destination. Soldiers weakened, unable to hold their ground. Rumors spread like sparks in dry grass, stories of fever, of swellings beneath the skin, of people dying in a single night. But rumors are easy to dismiss when the road ahead is long and trade must go on. One place where the sickness made itself undeniably known was the bustling port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea. Here, Genoese merchants had established a thriving colony, a hub for goods flowing between east and west. In the 1340s, the city found itself under siege by a Mongol army. But as the months dragged on, the attackers themselves were struck by something strange and terrifying. Their numbers dwindled, not from battle, but from disease. Chroniclers tell us that, in a desperate act, the Mongols began to hurl the corpses of their fallen over the city walls, hoping to spread their misery to those inside. Whether this story is entirely true or partly legend, its image lingers. Bodies flying through the air, carrying with them a sickness no wall could keep out. Within Kaffa, people began to fall ill, their bodies overcome with fever and the dreaded swellings, painful lumps in the armpits, groin, and neck, signs of something the world had not seen on this scale before. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Merchants and sailors fled the city, boarding ships in haste, hoping to outrun the pestilence. But many carried it with them, hidden in their blood or in the rats and fleas that traveled in the holds of their vessels. In their flight, they became messengers of death, though they did not yet know it. Imagine the scene. Ships rocking gently on the Black Sea, their sails filled with wind, their cargo tied down securely. The sailors went about their work, mending ropes, steering the helm, boiling salted fish for supper, while somewhere below deck, unseen, rats scurried in the dark, carrying fleas that carried death. No one could hear it, no one could see it, but it was there, waiting. Back on land in towns across Asia and the Middle East, the shadows lengthened. In bazaars once filled with chatter, stalls grew empty. Caravanserai that had hosted travelers for centuries fell silent. The ordinary sounds of life, traders bargaining, children laughing, horses stamping in their stables, were replaced by quieter, more haunting noises. The low prayers of the sick, the mournful wails of families, and more often, the toll of bells. And yet, even as fear spread, life continued. The roads did not empty overnight. Ships still set sail. Markets reopened after each wave of illness, for trade was the bloodline of empires. Hope flickered stubbornly in human hearts, even as the shadows gathered around them. For those who lived far away, these stories felt distant, like tales carried on the wind. Surely they thought such horrors belonged to far-off places, lands beyond the horizon. Surely the sickness would fade before it reached them. But the trade winds did not stop, and the roads did not end. The shadows that had fallen in the east were already stretching westward, carried by merchants and sailors who thought they had escaped. And so, in silence, the Black Death continued its journey. Quietly, invisibly, it moved closer, preparing to knock at the gates of Europe. In the autumn of 1447, a small fleet of ships left the Black Sea, their sails catching the winds that would carry them westward. They were Genoese merchant vessels, sturdy and weathered from long journeys across distant waters.
Their holds were heavy with cargo. Grain, cloth, spices, treasures destined for eager buyers in the Mediterranean ports. To those waiting on the shorelines of Sicily, their arrival meant business, prosperity, and the familiar rhythm of trade. But as the ships glided across the waves, something stirred within their darkened hulls. It was not only cargo that traveled with them. Among the ropes, barrels, and sacks of grain, rats scurried unseen. Fleas clung to their fur, feeding on blood, carrying within their tiny bodies the invisible seed of catastrophe. Above deck, life went on much as it always did for sailors. They worked in shifts, guiding the ship by the stars at night, patching sails by day. They ate simple meals, bread that grew harder with each passing week, salted fish softened by water, thin wine poured sparingly from barrels. They told stories to pass the time, sang songs to keep spirits steady, and whispered prayers when the seas grew rough. The ocean's endless rhythm was familiar, comforting even. And yet, aboard these ships, whispers of something darker soon began. A sailor fell ill with fever, his strength gone in a matter of hours. Another collapsed, his body shaking, his skin marked by strange swellings beneath the arms and at the groin. The crew had seen sickness before, scurvy, fevers, wounds from hard work, but never anything like this. It came suddenly, fiercely, and left little time for recovery. Panic spread among the men, though they tried to keep working. On the open sea, there was nowhere to run.
The ship creaked forward, sails filled with wind, but death walked silently among the crew. Each morning, fewer men rose to their duties. Each evening, more bodies lay still, wrapped hastily in cloth before being committed to the sea. The quiet splash of a weighted corpse slipping into the waves became a sound all too familiar. Imagine the eerie silence that must have filled those decks. The usual chatter of sailors dulled into whispers, then into nothing at all. Only the wind and the water kept their steady song, as though indifferent to the suffering of the men aboard. The ships pressed onward, drawn not by human hands, but by the steady push of wind and current. By the time the fleet reached Messina, on the island of Sicily, the city that greeted them had no idea of the visitor that had arrived. Townspeople rushed to the docks, eager for news, eager for trade. But what they found was not bustling sailors unloading goods, but silence. Many of the crew were already dead. Others staggered down gangplanks, too weak to speak, their faces pale, their bodies marked with the terrible signs of disease. Fear spread quickly through the port. The ships once welcomed were soon shunned. Some accounts say the authorities of Messina tried to drive them away, but it was too late. The sickness had already slipped ashore, carried not only by men, but by the rats that scurried from the ships into the warehouses, the streets, the homes of the city. In their fur, the fleas leapt to new hosts, continuing the cycle unseen. From Messina, the plague began its silent march across Europe. But in that first moment, as the ships floated into the harbor, the world changed quietly, almost without notice. What had begun in the distant east, what had traveled across the Black Sea and hidden in the darkness of a ship's hold, had finally reached the shores of Europe. For the people of Messina, it must have seemed at first like a strange misfortune, confined to a few unlucky sailors. They could not know that what had arrived was not a passing sickness, but the beginning of something far greater. In the narrow streets of the city, life went on in its familiar patterns. Markets opened, bells rang, children played. Yet the shadow had arrived, and it would not be turned away. The ship that brought grain and spices had also brought silence. The silence of fevered men too weak to speak. The silence of families who would soon close their doors in fear. The silence of death creeping quietly, unseen, unstoppable. This was how it began. On a ship of silence, sailing calmly across the waves, carrying within it the fate of millions. In the year 1347, as the summer gave way to autumn, a small fleet of merchant ships set sail from the Black Sea. They were Genoese vessels, solid and dependable, built for long journeys and heavy cargo. To those who waited for them farther west, they carried wealth. Sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, casks of oil and wine, spices that glowed with color and perfumed the air. Their approach would have been greeted with anticipation. For towns and cities around the Mediterranean, these ships were lifelines of trade, promise, and prosperity. But as they cut across the waters, their sails full of wind, another cargo lay hidden in the shadows below deck. It was not listed on any manifest, not bargained for in any market. In the holds where sacks of wheat were stacked, rats darted among the shadows. Their bodies carried fleas, and in those fleas, unseen and silent, a sickness stirred. The men on deck had no idea of the company they kept. Life for sailors at sea was hard, but familiar. They woke at dawn, the creak of the mast and the slap of waves against the hull their daily alarm. Salt crusted their skin, and the wind tangled their hair. They worked the rigging, adjusted the sails, and scrubbed the deck with rough brushes until the wood gleamed damp in the sunlight. Meals were plain and repetitive. Hard bread dipped in broth, salted fish softened by water, thin wine poured sparingly from barrels. They told stories to pass the time, sang songs to keep spirits steady, and whispered prayers when the seas grew rough. The ocean's endless rhythm was familiar, comforting even. And yet, aboard these ships, whispers of something darker soon began. A sailor fell ill with fever, his strength gone in a matter of hours. Another collapsed, his body shaking, his skin marked by strange swellings beneath the arms and at the groin. The crew had seen sickness before, scurvy, fevers, wounds from hard work, but never anything like this. It came suddenly, fiercely, and left little time for recovery. Panic spread among the men, though they tried to keep working. On the open sea, there was nowhere to run. The ship creaked forward, sails filled with wind, but death walked silently among the crew.
Other cities would soon hear their own bells toll, their own streets fall silent, their own graveyards overflow. But in Messina, the people could not imagine what was to come. They saw only their own suffering, their own grief. They lived moment to moment, trying to care for the sick, trying to bury the dead, trying to keep the sickness from their own homes. Each toll of the bell was a reminder of their fragility, of how quickly life could be extinguished. And so, the bells of Messina rang on. What had once been symbols of joy and order became the constant voice of death. Their sound marked the beginning of something far greater than the city could have known, a shadow spreading outward, carried by trade and travel, soon to touch all of Europe. The bells tolled not only for the dead of Messina, they tolled for the world. Before the sickness came, Messina's marketplace had been the heartbeat of the city. Narrow streets opened into small squares, where wooden stalls leaned against one another, overflowing with goods. There were baskets of figs and olives, mounds of grain, bolts of linen dyed in bright hues, and clay jars of oil that gleamed in the sun. The air was rich with the smell of baked bread, roasted fish, and herbs crushed beneath the weight of passing feet. Voices overlapped in a chorus of barter and laughter, the familiar music of daily life. It was here, in the crowded marketplace, that news traveled fastest. A fisherman might hear a whisper from a sailor, and by afternoon it had spread from the docks to the baker's stall, from the baker to the spice seller, from the spice seller to the women haggling over fruit. The market was not just where food and wares were exchanged, it was where stories, rumors, and fears were passed from mouth to mouth. When the first deaths came, the market was filled with questions. Did you hear? Another sailor has fallen. They say a fever is spreading through the harbor. Some swear it is a punishment from God. The voices were low at first, half curious, half dismissive. Illness was not unknown after all. Fever, cough, and chills had passed through the city before. Perhaps, they thought, this was no different. But as the bells tolled more often, the tone of the whispers shifted. Faces grew tense. Merchants noticed fewer buyers. Some customers pulled their cloaks tighter around them, refusing to touch coins without wiping them first. Bread was sold without the usual banter. Fishmongers spoke little, their eyes darting to the side as if to measure the safety of those who lingered too close. In the corners of the marketplace, old women muttered prayers beneath their breath, their fingers tracing rosaries. Some men avoided strangers altogether, unwilling to breathe the same air. Yet others, desperate to explain the sudden sickness, spread darker rumors, that the sailors had brought poison, that wells had been tampered with, that foreign traders carried a curse. Fear gave shape to suspicion, and suspicion gave birth to stories that spread as quickly as the fleas themselves. Still, the market could not simply stop. People needed food. Grain had to be ground. Fish had to be caught. Oil had to be sold. Families came in silence, keeping their distance, hurrying to buy what they needed before retreating home. Yet, with each passing day, more stalls stood empty. Merchants who had fallen sick or fled left their goods untended, Their wooden booths shuddered. What was once a riot of colors and voices became patchwork silence. Children, once darting between stalls with sticky fingers and bright eyes, now clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed with confusion. They heard the whispers too. They saw the way adults kept their voices low, the way neighbors avoided one another, the way the market that had been a place of abundance now felt like a place of unease. Among the whispers, a new kind of talk began. Some spoke of prayers to the Virgin Mary, of candles lit in hopes of divine mercy. Others suggested offerings to saints, or fasts, to turn away God's anger. A few, bolder in their beliefs, muttered of darker forces, of demons loosed upon the earth. And still others, with hushed tones, wondered if this was the end of days itself. One might have paused near a stall of figs to hear a fragment of such talk. They say in the East, whole towns have vanished. I heard it from a merchant just yesterday. He said corpses lie in the streets, unburied. Then it has come to us too. God help us. The marketplace became not just a center of trade, but of fear's multiplication. Every cough was noticed, every pale face questioned. The smallest sign of weakness, a stagger, a heavy breath, a bead of sweat, drew wary glances. Trust, once abundant, began to wither. Yet even in this fear, life continued in small ways. A baker still set out his loaves, their crusts golden. A woman still sold herbs she swore would strengthen the lungs. A fisherman still lifted his catch for buyers to see, though his hands shook as he did so. People clung to these rituals, these fragments of normality, as if the old patterns of life might shield them from the new shadow that hung over the city. But the whispers could not be silenced. They traveled with every basket, every coin, every loaf of bread. The market that had once bound the city together now carried its dread from house to house. And still, the bells rang in the distance. The whispers paused each time the mournful sound drifted over the rooftops, then resumed again, softer, heavier. For the people of Messina, the market was no longer the heart of abundance. It had become the echo chamber of their fear, a place where silence and murmurs mixed with the smell of bread and fish, where every trade carried with it not just food, but the question of survival. The sickness had entered the market, and through the market it would touch every home. As the sickness spread through Messina, life retreated inward. Where once streets bustled with voices, carts, and the laughter of children, shutters now closed tightly and doors stayed barred. The city that had always lived outward, in markets and squares and church gatherings, began to turn in on itself. Families withdrew into their homes, clinging to the fragile hope that wood and stone might protect them from what lingered outside. Inside, households grew quiet. By candlelight, mothers whispered prayers over their children, hoping that the walls around them could hold back the invisible terror. Fathers stacked sacks of grain against the door as if food and barriers could keep sickness away. Rooms that once rang with the noise of work and play now held only whispers, the creak of furniture, and the muffled sound of coughing when illness broke through. The rich fared differently from the poor. In houses of stone, where rooms were spacious and windows high, there was more space to retreat, more air to breathe. Servants moved carefully, trying to avoid their master's gaze if a cough or fever touched them. Some nobles sent their children away to the countryside, believing that open fields would shield them from what stalked the city. Others gathered their families and fled altogether, leaving behind empty homes with shutters fastened and gates locked. For the poor, retreat was harder. Their homes were small, often not more than 1 or 2 rooms where many lived together. The air was close, the bed shared, the food scarce. To close the door meant to seal themselves in with little comfort, and if sickness entered, there was no escaping it. Neighbors who once shared bread or helped mend clothes now avoided one another. Each family huddled in its own fragile world. The fear of contact was deep. Some families refused even to visit the sick relatives, leaving food and water at the door, retreating before seeing the face they loved. Others, unable to abandon their kin, stayed close, wiping brows, whispering prayers, and waiting helplessly as the illness ran its course. In both choices, distance or closeness, there was grief. Windows became frames for anxious eyes. Children peered out between shutters, watching empty streets where only the occasional figure hurried past. Those who dared to go outside wrapped cloths over their mouths, carried sprigs of herbs or flowers to ward off the poisoned air. The scent of rosemary and lavender, strong and sharp, drifted through doorways and hung in corners, a fragile shield against fear. Food became a quiet struggle. With markets shrinking and merchants fleeing, families rationed what they had. Bread grew stale, beans and lentils stretched thin, some chewed bitter roots or boiled weeds gathered from the edges of the city. Fires were kept burning, both for cooking and for protection, the smoke thought to cleanse the air of the sickness that lingered unseen. Inside these shuttered homes, time slowed. Days blurred together, marked not by the bustle of the street, but by the tolling of bells and the sounds of coughing behind thin walls. Families spoke in low voices, conserving both energy and hope. Some told stories to pass the hours, old legends of saints and heroes, as if words might push back the silence. Others sat in prayer, their lips moving endlessly over familiar devotions, beads slipping through trembling fingers. In some homes, the silence grew heavier still. One by one, members of a family might fall ill, until only one or two remained. Doors stayed closed, but neighbors noticed when no sound came from within, when smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Sometimes, days later, the door would be forced open, revealing a house emptied by death, its silence deeper than any prayer could fill. Behind those closed doors, fear was not only of the sickness, but of abandonment. The city had always been a community, its people bound by trade, by church, by kinship. Now, isolation frayed those ties. Suspicion crept in. Had a neighbor brought the sickness nearer? Was a friend careless with contact? Love itself was tested as the instinct to protect clashed with the instinct to flee. And yet, even in the shadow of death, humanity persisted. A mother still hummed a lullaby to her child, even as fever burned in both their bodies. A father carved a small wooden toy, pressing it into his son's hand, though his own trembled with weakness. Sisters whispered secrets to one another in the dark, their words a comfort against the silence pressing on all sides. Behind closed doors, life shrank, but did not vanish. It became smaller, more fragile, more fleeting. Every moment together carried more weight, every gesture of care a defiance of despair. Outside, the bells tolled endlessly, but inside, in the shuttered rooms of Messina, the world narrowed to families huddled together, to whispered prayers, to quiet acts of love carried out in the face of fear. The sickness could enter doors and shatter households, but it could not silence the small, stubborn rhythms of human life. And though the people of Messina did not know it, their retreat behind closed doors was mirrored across the continent, as city after city would soon face the same choice: to turn inward, to cling to one another, and to wait in silence for the plague to pass. In the narrow streets of Messina, where silence had begun to spread like a shadow, there were still those who stepped forward when others stepped back. They were the healers, the physicians, the barber surgeons, the midwives, the herbalists. Their task had always been to tend to the sick, to ease suffering where they could. And in ordinary times, their work was respected, sometimes even revered. But in these days of sudden, inexplicable illness, their burden grew almost unbearable. Physicians of the 14th century carried with them the weight of ancient learning. They studied the writings of Galen and Hippocrates, texts copied carefully by monks and preserved in great libraries. They spoke of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Believing health depended on their balance, illness, they taught, was the result of imbalance, of excess or deficiency. Treatments were designed to restore equilibrium, bleeding a patient, purging them with strong herbs, adjusting their diet. But now, as they stood at the bedsides of those struck by the plague, those teachings seemed powerless. The swellings appeared suddenly, painfully, blackening the flesh. Fever burned, coughs rattled lungs, and no bleeding or purging seemed to make any difference. The patients still died quickly, cruelly, leaving their healers helpless. Yet the healers continued. Some physicians entered homes with bundles of herbs tucked into their belts, hoping the scents would purify the air. They carried small vials of vinegar, dipping cloths into it and holding them over their mouths, believing it would ward off the miasma, the poisoned air thought to carry disease. The scent of rosemary and lavender, strong and sharp, drifted through doorways and hung in corners, a fragile shield against fear. Barber surgeons, with fewer books but practical hands, tried what they knew. They lanced the swellings, hoping to release the poison, though the sight was grim and the relief fleeting. They offered poultices of herbs, pressed against the skin to draw out sickness, though the swellings only grew darker. They washed wounds with wine, its sharp sting a poor substitute for cure. Midwives and wise women who had long cared for their neighbors with remedies passed down through generations also came. They brought bundles of rosemary, lavender, and thyme, scattering them across floors or burning them in small fires to cleanse the air. They brewed teas from chamomile and fennel to soothe pain and whispered prayers over their patients, crossing themselves as they worked. But as the days passed, the healers found themselves not only powerless, but endangered. Many fell ill themselves, having breathed the same air, touched the same bodies, stood too long in rooms heavy with fever. A physician might begin the day at a patient's bedside and end it in his own, sweating beneath blankets, the same swellings rising on his body. Families who had looked to him for hope now looked upon his decline with despair. Fear began to creep even into the work of healing. Some physicians fled, abandoning their posts, their reputations unable to hold against the terror of death. Others charged high fees, refusing to tend the poor unless they could pay dearly, though money meant little once sickness entered a home. But yet, some remained, tireless in their efforts, knowing each visit might be their last. The burden was not only in the tending of bodies, but in the tending of spirits. Families, frightened and grieving, asked questions the healers could not answer. Will she recover? What can we do? Why has God sent this upon us? The healers, men and women of flesh and bone, had no words to calm such fears. They could only sit in silence, listening to the sound of coughing, the rasp of breath, the tolling of bells beyond the walls. For those who tried, every day was a choice between courage and despair. They carried their remedies in small pouches, their books under their arms, their prayers on their lips, and they walked into houses where others dare not go. They left with the smell of sickness clinging to their clothes, their hands raw from washing, their hearts heavy with the memory of faces they could not save. At times, their work seemed almost ritual rather than cure.
Burning herbs, bleeding patients, laying cool cloths on fevered brows, it was less about halting the sickness than about giving families something to cling to, a sign that they were not entirely abandoned. In the presence of such helplessness, even the gesture of care held meaning. And perhaps that was the truest burden of all, not the labor of hands, nor the failure of remedies, but the weight of bearing witness. The healers watched again and again as life slipped away. They saw the pain in the eyes of children, the grief in the faces of parents, the silence of homes that had once been filled with laughter. They could not turn away, and so they carried those memories with them, heavier than any bag of herbs or satchel of tools. As Messina's streets grew quieter, the healers' footsteps remained among the few that still echoed. They moved from door to door, house to house, their presence both feared and welcomed. Behind them, the city seemed to close in, each home shuddered, each family waiting. But the healers walked on, burdened by knowledge they could not apply, driven by duty they could not forsake. In the end, their remedies could not halt the plague,
But their hands, their presence, their willingness to step into darkness, these became small flames against the vast shadow. And though many of them died, their burden carried on, echoed centuries later in the stories told of their courage, their failure, and their humanity. In the days when Messina's streets fell silent and the bells tolled more often than the laughter of children, people turned their eyes upward. Faith had always been the foundation of life in medieval Europe. Every morning began with prayer, every feast day marked by the rhythm of the church calendar, every joy and sorrow accompanied by the presence of God, saints, and sacraments. But when the plague arrived, faith and fear became tangled so tightly that one could scarcely tell them apart. The first instinct of many was to seek mercy. Churches filled quickly, not with song, but with sobbing. Families knelt together on cold stone floors, whispering prayers beneath vaulted ceilings, their voices echoing in the dim candlelight. They begged for protection, for forgiveness, for healing. Priests, though fearful themselves, raised their voices in sermons that quivered with urgency. They spoke of sin, of punishment, of repentance. Many told their flocks that the sickness was no accident, but a scourge sent by God to chastise his people for their pride, greed, and neglect of virtue. For some, these words cut deeply. Mothers clasped their children closer, confessing their sins with trembling lips. Men who once chased wealth began to empty their purses into the alms box, hoping generosity would erase their guilt. Neighbors who had quarreled sought forgiveness, their voices breaking as they embraced in tears. In every corner of the city, whispers rose. This was the end of days, foretold in the scriptures. Yet faith, so often a comfort, also carried with it a sharper edge. Some communities began to search for scapegoats. Rumors spread like wildfire, faster even than the sickness itself. Some said the plague came from wells poisoned by strangers. Others whispered that it was punishment for heresy, for tolerance of Jews, for disobedience to the church. Fear fed suspicion, and suspicion fed violence. In towns across Europe, innocent people, particularly Jews, were accused of causing the plague and faced brutal persecution. Messina was not spared these murmurs, though its greatest suffering came from within. At the same time, a strange fervor gripped certain hearts. Bands of men and women known as flagellants marched through the streets, their backs bare, their whips heavy with knots and metal tips. They struck themselves again and again until blood ran down their shoulders. With each lash, they cried out prayers, begging God to have mercy on humanity. Their chants filled the night air, eerie and unrelenting, while families peered from shuttered windows, torn between awe and terror. Some joined them, convinced that only through shared suffering could divine forgiveness be won. But not everyone found God in fear. For others, the plague shook the foundations of belief. How could a loving Creator allow children to die so swiftly, so cruelly? How could the saints, so often invoked for healing, remain silent now? Priests themselves sometimes faltered. Many fled their parishes, unwilling to administer last rites to the sick. Altars stood empty, candles burned out, and parishioners wept alone in their homes. The absence of spiritual guidance left a hollow ache, a wound as raw as the plague itself. Still, faith endured, even if altered. In darkened rooms, mothers taught their children to recite the Lord's Prayer, their voices steady, though their hands shook. Small processions carried crosses through the streets, though the crowds were thinner with each passing week. Bells rang for Mass, though fewer came, fearful of standing too close to one another. The churchyards filled with graves, yet above each mound a cross still stood, a sign that even in despair the promise of salvation lingered. Faith was not only practiced within the church walls. In homes, families hung sprigs of blessed herbs over their doors, hoping to keep out evil spirits. Holy water was sprinkled across thresholds, while psalms were whispered at night to keep death at bay.
Candles burned before icons of the Virgin Mary, flickering light casting gentle shadows on weary faces. And always fear walked beside it. People dreamed of angels and demons, of judgment and damnation. They watched the skies for signs, strange storms, unusual stars, eclipses, and wondered if heaven itself was sending warnings. Every cough from a neighbor, every shadow in the alley, seemed to carry both earthly and divine meaning. For some, faith and fear gave rise to acts of great kindness. Priests who remained became beacons of hope, walking into homes heavy with sickness to offer last rites, risking their lives to comfort the dying. Monks prayed day and night, their chants echoing through cloisters, even as their own numbers dwindled. Sisters of mercy nursed strangers, whispering hymns as they cooled fevered brows. In their presence, faith overcame fear, if only for a moment. For others, fear consumed faith. Men abandoned their families, convinced that proximity meant certain death. Women cursed God, tearing down holy images in despair. Robbers stole from the dead, justifying their deeds with the belief that divine punishment had already fallen and nothing more could matter. The streets of Messina became a mirror of the soul. Some hearts grew luminous in suffering, others darkened beyond recognition. Through it all, the sound of bells never ceased. They rang for prayers, for funerals, for processions. Each toll was both a summons to faith and a reminder of fear. To hear them was to be called to trust in eternity while standing in the shadow of mortality. And so, in Messina and across the world, people lived in the tension between heaven and earth, between devotion and terror. Faith could not prevent the plague, but it gave meaning to suffering. Fear could not be banished, but it kept people alert, cautious, aware of their frailty. Together, they formed the strange heartbeat of a city that endured even as it withered, a rhythm that echoed in the silent nights and trembling prayers of an age marked by both belief and dread. There is a strange weight to silence when it falls upon a place once alive with sound. Messina, like all Mediterranean cities of its time, was never meant to be quiet. Its streets were arteries of life, filled with the clatter of hoofs, the call of merchants, the laughter of children, the chants of priests leading processions.
But as the Black Death deepened its hold, those same streets became hushed corridors of stone, echoing not with life, but with absence. The first signs of emptiness came gradually. Markets that once spilled over with baskets of olives, figs, and bread began to thin. A few stalls closed, their owners too sick or too frightened to come. Shutters remained drawn on certain shops, doors barred, though goods still lay inside. People told themselves it was temporary, that in a few days the missing neighbors would return. But the days stretched on, and the shutters stayed closed. Soon, entire neighborhoods seemed frozen in place. Doors locked from within, streets where weeds began to poke through cobblestones. The hum of trade that had once drawn ships to Messina's harbor dwindled into a stillness that unnerved even the seabirds circling overhead. Fishermen left their boats tied to the docks, unwilling to cast nets where no market awaited their catch. Children, who had once darted between stalls and splashed water from wells, vanished from view. Their absence was one of the most haunting silences of all. Streets that had echoed with their shouts of play now held only the rustle of wind against banners, the groan of shutters in the breeze, the lonely cry of a crow perched atop a church spire. At times, the emptiness was broken not by life, but by the rituals of death. Carts creaked slowly down the streets, carrying bodies covered with rough cloth or piled under blankets. A single driver, sometimes masked, sometimes not, urged a tired horse forward while the cartwheels squealed against the stones. People watched from behind shuttered windows, their eyes wide and fearful, unwilling to step outside but unable to turn away. When the cart disappeared, silence rushed back in, deeper than before. At night, the stillness grew heavier. No lamps lit the streets, for few dared to walk them. The once lively taverns stood deserted, their doors bolted, their benches overturned. Even the strayed dogs that had scavenged scraps from markets began to vanish, their barks no longer echoing against the walls. The city became a shadow of itself, a hollow stage where the play of life had suddenly ended. Those who braved the streets moved with caution. Cloaked figures hurried along, heads down, herbs pressed to their noses. They avoided touching walls, avoided each other, avoided even the stray objects left behind. A fallen shoe, a broken basket, a cloak dropped in haste. Each item seemed tainted, carrying with it the invisible breath of death. And yet, within this eerie emptiness, there were small flickers of human resilience. Some priests still walked the streets at dusk, carrying a cross high as they muttered blessings over deserted alleys. A few merchants laid out goods, though buyers were scarce. Fishermen, unable to stay idle, sometimes returned with their nets, giving away fish to hungry neighbors rather than letting them rot. These acts stood out sharply against the silence, like candles flickering in vast darkness. Travelers who arrived in Messina during those months often spoke of the city as though it were already half a ghost. Ships approached the harbor to find fewer voices calling, fewer hands reaching for ropes, fewer faces on the docks. Streets seemed abandoned, though in truth families huddled inside their homes, unseen behind bolted doors. The city was full of people, and yet it looked empty, its life hidden away, withdrawn into the shadows. Even the architecture seemed to change under the weight of silence. Churches loomed taller, their bells tolling into near-deserted air. Arched doorways, once thresholds of welcome, became barriers against intrusion. The sound of one set of footsteps could echo as if the city itself listened. The air grew heavy, and the stones seemed to remember the countless feet that no longer passed over them. For the people who lived through it, the emptiness carried a strange dual meaning. On one hand, it was terrifying, a constant reminder that death was near, that life itself was retreating. On the other, it was oddly protective. A quiet street meant fewer chances of contact, fewer opportunities for sickness to spread. Silence became both a wound and a shield, cutting off joy while preserving breath. The quiet also gave way to imagination. Behind shuttered windows, families whispered about what might lurk in the empty alleys. Spirits of the dead wandering aimlessly. Demons pleased with the plague. Angels moving invisibly to mock the faithful. Every groan of wood, every distant sound carried meaning in a world where silence had become too vast to ignore. Perhaps most haunting of all was the memory of what once was. In their minds, the people of Messina carried the sounds of ordinary life, the bells announcing feasts, the cries of traders selling silk and spice, the songs of sailors returning to port. They remembered laughter in taverns, the pounding of blacksmiths at their forges, the rhythm of markets alive with bargaining. To walk now through empty streets was to walk among ghosts, not of the dead, but of the living,
who had once filled the city with noise and motion. And as the weeks passed, silence became its own presence, heavy and unyielding. It wrapped itself around every corner, settled into every stone. Messina became a city in waiting, caught between the memory of what it had been and the uncertain shadow of what it might become. In time, the silence would spread far beyond Messina. Other cities would feel it: Florence, Paris, London, each one learning the weight of streets that once bustled but now lay still. But in Messina, it was first felt as both a horror and a revelation, that life could vanish so swiftly, leaving behind only empty streets, where silence spoke more loudly than any voice. Messina was not an isolated town tucked away in the hills. It was a port, a meeting point of worlds, a place where the sea itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of trade. For centuries, ships had come and gone, laden with grain, silk, wool, and spice. The harbor was the city's heart, pulsing with life as sails rose and fell, as sailors shouted across the decks, as merchants waited on the docks with eager eyes. But when the Black Death arrived, the sea that once brought wealth became a messenger of grief. Ships, meant to carry goods and fortune, now bore something unseen, something far heavier than their cargo. The same waters that had connected Messina to distant markets now connected it to distant miseries. The earliest vessels that carried the sickness did so unknowingly. Rats scurried in the holds, fleas clung to their fur, and sailors, weary from long voyages, stepped ashore already weakened by fever. At first, no one understood the danger. A ship docking meant goods to sell, wages to earn, food to buy. Even as whispers of sickness grew, the habit of trade was hard to break. Merchants hurried down gangplanks, and families greeted returning fathers with tears of joy. Within days, joy turned to mourning. Word spread quickly along the coast. In Catania, Palermo, and other Sicilian ports, stories circulated of the sickness in Messina. But stories, like the sea, did not stop at one shore. Captains who had fled the harbor brought their tales elsewhere, tales of death, of sudden illness, of bells tolling without pause. Their words carried fear, but their ships carried more. In every port they touched, they left behind not just rumor, but the seeds of contagion. The sea became both escape and betrayal. Some fled Messina by boat, hoping that distance might mean safety. Families packed what they could, clutching children as they boarded ships bound for Naples, Genoa, or Marseille.
They thought themselves fortunate to leave behind the shuttered streets and the ringing bells. But in their departure, they carried the plague with them. What seemed a voyage of salvation became instead a voyage of sorrow, each new destination receiving not refugees alone, but the sickness that had driven them away. In Marseille, merchants greeted the ships with curiosity. They expected silks, spices, and grain, the usual treasures of Mediterranean trade. They did not expect the coughing sailors, the pale faces, the fevered children. Within days, the same bells that had tolled in Messina began to toll in France. From there, the sickness would march inland, carried not just by sea, but by river, by road, by the countless feet of travelers who never guessed what they bore. Back in Messina, the harbor itself grew strange. Ships docked in silence, their crews too weak to call out. Some vessels floated eerily with no voices on board, their sails slack, their decks littered with bodies. Dock workers hesitated before approaching, fearing what they might find. Yet hunger drove them on. Grain still needed unloading. Goods still tempted the desperate. And so the cycle continued. Contact, trade, sickness, sorrow. The sea winds, once filled with the salty tang of fish and tar, now seemed heavy with unease. The cries of gulls echoed more sharply in the silence. Nets were cast less often, for even fishermen feared what the sea might bring back. The very water that had given life to Messina now seemed to shimmer with menace, though no eye could see the danger it carried. Sailors themselves bore the deepest weight. Men accustomed to storms and shipwrecks, to pirates and peril, now faced an enemy they could not fight. On deck, they whispered of curses, of divine punishment, of demons riding the waves. Some refused to leave their ships, preferring to die on the water rather than in strange, deserted cities. Others begged priests for blessings before setting sail, their hands gripping rosaries as tightly as they once gripped ropes. And yet, even in the face of fear, the sea did not rest. Trade continued, though limping. Ships still moved, their sails blotting the horizon, their paths weaving a web across the Mediterranean. But with each journey, sorrow spread further. Florence, Venice, Barcelona, each would soon know what Messina already knew. The Black Death did not belong to one city alone. It belonged to all who lived by the water, all who opened their gates to trade, all who trusted the sea to bring prosperity. The plague was no longer a local disaster. It was a tide, and like the tide, it rose higher with each passing week, touching more shores, swallowing more lives, unstoppable in its reach. Messina's suffering had become the world's. Still, the sea carried not only sorrow, but memory. In later years, survivors would recall the ships that brought the sickness, the day the harbor fell silent, the sight of sails disappearing into the horizon, carrying with them both hope and despair. For some, the sea would forever be a reminder of loss. For others, it remained a promise of connection, proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could not be isolated. But in that first winter, as the bells tolled and the streets emptied, the sea was a mirror of grief. It carried Messina's sorrow outward, wave by wave, until no shore remained untouched. When the plague had passed its first terrible wave, when the bells tolled less often, and the carts of the dead no longer creaked daily down the streets, Messina was left in a strange and fragile quiet. For those who remained alive, survival was not triumph, but burden. The city was not whole. Homes were empty, families shattered, churches half deserted. Survivors walked through streets that felt like shadows of themselves, seeing with eyes forever changed. For many, the first memory was silence. They remembered how the voices of neighbors had vanished, how laughter had been replaced by coughing, how songs in taverns gave way to tolling bells. To survive was to carry those echoes within, to look at a familiar street and hear in the mind's ear the absence of what once filled it. Children were among the most haunting witnesses. Some had lost both parents, left to the care of distant relatives or neighbors. Their young eyes had seen carts loaded with bodies, had heard whispered prayers over fevered brothers and sisters. When they grew older, those children spoke less of games and more of graves, their childhoods marked by an invisible scar. A city that had once promised them life had shown them death first. Adults, too, carried wounds deeper than any plague sore. Husbands remembered wives lost in fever. Wives remembered husbands buried at dawn.
Parents remembered the stillness of cradles, the absence of small footsteps in their homes. Each survivor carried a gallery of ghosts, not painted on walls, but etched in memory. Faces that would never again smile across a table or share a word by the fire. Some spoke of survivor's guilt, though they did not have a name for it then. They wondered why they still breathed while so many others did not. A man might lie awake at night asking why death had passed over his bed but taken the family next door. A woman might weep over her bread, ashamed to eat when her sister had starved. Even in prayer, gratitude was mixed with sorrow, thankfulness with unease. Others carried a kind of hardness, as though survival required a shell around the heart. They did not speak often of what they had seen, but their silence itself was a story. Their eyes were older than their years, their faces marked not just by age, but by memory. These were the men and women who rebuilt markets, who swept streets, who reopened taverns. They carried the city forward, but they did so with a quietness that revealed the weight of what they had endured. Yet, among survivors was also resilience. People who had once quarreled came together, bound by shared suffering. Neighbors shared food more freely. Strangers offered shelter. Guilds welcomed those who had lost family members into their ranks. The plague had taken much, but it had also stripped life down to what was essential: bread, water, company, prayer. Survivors learned to value these things more deeply than before. Faith itself looked different through survivors' eyes. Some clung more tightly than ever to the church, seeing their survival as a gift from God, a sign of mercy. They lit candles for the dead, they prayed longer, they confessed more often. Others, however, felt their faith shaken. They looked at empty churches and silent altars and wondered why heaven had been so quiet. For them, survival meant wrestling with doubt, asking questions that had no easy answers. Survivors also carried new fears. A cough in the night, a neighbor who fell ill, these sounds brought back dread, even when the worst had passed. Mothers checked their children's foreheads more often. Fathers worried over every sniffle. The memory of how swiftly death had come made even ordinary sickness feel like a shadow of the plague. But alongside fear was gratitude. Survivors looked at the faces still with them and felt a sharper love. Meals together were precious, laughter more fragile, embraces longer. Weddings were celebrated with tears as much as joy, for each union felt like defiance against the silence that had claimed so many. Births were welcomed not just with joy, but with relief, as though each new child was proof that life had not been extinguished. The landscape of the city itself became part of the survivors' memory. Certain streets were remembered not for their markets, but for the number of bodies carried along them. Certain homes, once bustling with family, stood empty, silent memorials to what had been.
Survivors learned to walk through these places with eyes that saw both the present and the absent at once. Over time, the survivors became storytellers. They told children born after the plague of what it had been like, of the empty streets, the carts of the dead, the silence of bells. They described how neighbors had vanished, how the city had felt hollow, how faith and fear had walked hand in hand. These stories were not told to frighten, but to preserve memory, to ensure that the world would not forget what it had endured. Yet memory is a double-edged gift. To remember was to honor, but also to grieve again. Survivors carried both, the duty of memory and the ache it brought. They built their lives upon foundations of loss.
their eyes forever reflecting the quiet shadows of what they had seen. And still, from those same eyes, a different light sometimes shone, the light of endurance. For in surviving, they had proven that life, fragile as it was, could endure even the fiercest storm. Their gaze carried both sorrow and strength, both mourning and hope. The plague had changed Messina, and it had changed the people within it. To walk through the city after the sickness was to see not only the scars on stone, but the deeper scars on faces, in voices, in silences. Survivors' eyes told the story, eyes that had seen too much, yet still looked forward, because looking backward alone was too heavy to bear. In time, other cities would look to Messina's survivors as both warning and testament. The Black Death would spread far beyond Sicily, reshaping all of Europe. But in Messina, the survivors stood first as living witnesses, their eyes carrying the memory of what it meant to live through a silence that had nearly swallowed the world. When the sickness loosened its grip, the world that emerged was not the same as the one that had entered it. The Black Death had torn through homes, markets, churches, and streets with such ferocity that nothing remained untouched. Survivors did not step back into the old rhythm of life. Instead, they found themselves standing in a world reshaped by absence, by memory, and by new ways of thinking. The most immediate change was in the fields and streets. Laborers were fewer. Fields lay untended, harvests rotted, tools rested unused. In many places, whole villages had disappeared, their homes abandoned, their churches empty. The land itself seemed to sigh with neglect, waiting for hands that were no longer there to till the soil or mend the fences. But scarcity, while cruel, also altered the balance of life. Where once the poor had worked endlessly for little, now their labor carried greater weight. A plowman could demand more wages, a mason more food, a servant more freedom. Lords and merchants, desperate to rebuild, found themselves granting concessions they would never have considered before. The old order trembled, and though power remained in the hands of the wealthy, the voices of the common people grew louder in its echoes. Cities, too, changed. Where streets had been crowded and markets overflowing, now there was more space, more silence. Some saw this as a wound. Others saw opportunity. Houses left empty by death were taken over by survivors, who moved into larger homes than they had ever dreamed of. Property shifted hands swiftly, inheritance spreading wealth among unexpected heirs. The rich became richer, but so too did some who had once lived in shadows. The map of ownership, of power, was redrawn in subtle ways across the continent. Faith, shaken by silence, found new paths. The church remained central, but trust in its absolute authority was dented. People had seen priests flee, had buried their dead without last rites, had prayed fervently only to see prayers unanswered. Some clung more tightly to devotion, their churches filled with sobbing penitents. Others turned inward, seeking God not only in altars, but in the quiet of their own homes, in private prayer and personal reflection. This shift would linger, paving the way for future challenges to the church's dominance. Art and imagination also bore the mark of change. Images of death, once rare, became common. Murals and carvings showed skeletons dancing, figures of death leading nobles and peasants alike in a grim procession. These were not works of despair,
but of reminder that life was fragile, that wealth and rank could not shield anyone, that time itself walked hand in hand with mortality. The theme of the danse macabre, the dance of death, spread across Europe, a reflection of the shared experience of loss. In the marketplace of ideas, too, the plague planted seeds. Scholars began to ask questions not only of God, but of nature. If sickness could spread unseen, what caused it? Could it be measured, understood, prevented? Some clung to the theory of poisoned air, others to the alignment of the stars. But quietly, the need for reason, for study, for observation grew. Though centuries would pass before medicine truly changed, the Black Death had begun to carve cracks in unquestioned tradition. For ordinary people, daily life shifted in more subtle ways. Families became smaller, households leaner. Festivals, when they returned, were marked by both joy and restraint. Celebrations carried a sharper sweetness, for everyone knew how swiftly laughter could vanish. Weddings were more treasured, births more sacred, friendships more fiercely guarded. Survivors had learned to love what remained, to grasp life more tightly because they had seen how easily it could slip away. The memory of silence lingered longest. In Messina and in Florence, Paris, London, and countless towns in between, the empty streets haunted imagination for generations. Even when life returned, the memory of absence stayed alive in stories told by firelight, in whispered warnings passed to children, in the cautious glance of a mother checking her child's cough. The Black Death had left not only graves, but shadows in the mind. The world also became more connected by loss. No longer was death something distant, happening only in far-off wars or occasional famine. Now it was a shared experience, across kingdoms, across languages, across seas. Whether one lived in Sicily or Spain, in England or the Holy Roman Empire, one carried the same scars, the same memories of bells tolling without end. In its terrible way, the plague made the world smaller, binding it with threads of grief. Some survivors turned this shared grief into renewal. They rebuilt cities with wider streets, more open squares, stronger walls. They invested in hospitals, in charities, in institutions meant to help the sick and poor. Others withdrew, hoarding wealth, fearing strangers, guarding themselves against future loss. The world that followed the plague was a patchwork of both generosity and fear, progress and retreat. But perhaps the most lasting change was in the way people saw themselves. Before the plague, life had felt steady, bound by tradition, upheld by the endless rhythm of birth, work, worship, and death. Afterward, life seemed more fragile, more uncertain, but also more precious. People saw that the old certainties could be swept away overnight. They began to hunger for new ways of living, new understandings of the world, new balances of power. In the centuries that followed, this hunger would shape revolutions in thought, faith, and society. The Black Death had taken so much, but in its ashes it left a changed humanity, a humanity more aware of its frailty, more alert to its mortality, but also more willing to question, to rebuild, to hope. The silence of empty streets had not only broken lives, but had carved new paths into the future.
And so, in Messina and beyond, survivors stood in a world both familiar and utterly transformed. They tilled fields again. They lit candles. They told stories. They laughed cautiously. Yet in every laugh, in every prayer, in every step, there was the faint shadow of what they had endured. The world had changed, and so had they. The Black Death passed, but its presence never fully disappeared. Time moved forward, as it always does, but the silence it had left behind still clung to the edges of memory. Streets filled again. Bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Markets bustled with trade. Yet even in the laughter of children, the rhythm of plows, and the songs of festivals, there was always an undertone, a shadow, an awareness of what had been lost. Stories of the plague became part of the fabric of Europe's memory. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the time when carts carried bodies through empty streets. Ballads and tales carried images of ghostly processions, of bells tolling in the dark, of priests whispering prayers in deserted chapels. These stories softened with time, told not always in fear, but in reverence, as reminders of how fragile life could be. And across the centuries, the echoes of those quiet moments shaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. When people built new towns, they remembered the crowded alleys where sickness had spread, and so they carved wider streets. When rulers raised taxes, they remembered the peasant revolts born from post-plague demands, and so they measured their grip more carefully. When scholars looked to the stars or studied the human body, they remembered the helplessness of doctors during the plague, and so they sought new knowledge. The silence of the Black Death was not an end, but a turning point. Even the rhythms of art and imagination carried the echo. The skeletal figures of the Dance of Death remained carved into church walls and painted onto manuscripts long after the plague itself had passed. These images reminded every passerby, every reader, that time was fleeting, that wealth and power could not guard against fate. Yet they also reminded people to live, to find joy, to cherish love, to sing songs, to hold close the warmth of a fire. The echo stretched into faith as well. The church endured, but its authority was no longer unquestioned. Quiet seeds of doubt had been planted in those years when priests had fled or when prayers had seemed unanswered. Centuries later, those seeds would blossom into reformations and renewals that reshaped the religious landscape of Europe. In this way, the whispers of the Black Death could still be heard in debates, in sermons, in the searching hearts of believers. Perhaps the most enduring echo, though, is one that remains even today. The reminder of our shared vulnerability and our shared resilience. The people of the 14th century had no cure, no true understanding of the sickness that swept their world. Yet they endured. They buried their dead with dignity. They cared for the sick when they could, even at risk to themselves. They sang songs again. They tilled fields again. They loved again. They bore witness to horror, and still they chose life. In this way, their quiet moments speak across the centuries. They remind us that even in the face of loss, humanity carries within it the ability to endure, to rebuild, to hope. The silence of Messina's harbor, the tolling bells of London, the deserted streets of Paris, these were not only scenes of grief, but also foundations upon which a changed world was built. And tonight, as their stories are told once more, they remind us that history is not only grand battles and kings, but also the soft footsteps of those who survived. The mothers who tucked children into bed despite their fear, the farmers who bent once more to the soil, the neighbors who whispered prayers in quiet chapels. These small acts, carried out in silence, were the true triumphs of the age. The Black Death changed the world, but it did not erase it. Life continued, reshaped and reimagined. The echoes of those quiet moments still reach us now, in the way we study illness, in the way we build our cities, in the way we tell stories to make sense of suffering. And perhaps as we listen, they remind us to cherish the fragile, fleeting gift of life itself. So let the echoes linger, not as terror, but as wisdom. Let the silence of those streets, the tolling of those bells, the whispered prayers in the dark remind us that every generation faces its own trials, its own shadows. And yet, like those who came before, we endure. The Black Death has long since faded, but its quiet moments still speak. They speak of fragility, they speak of loss,
But most of all, they speak of resilience, of humanity's enduring ability to find light even in the deepest darkness. And as the night grows still, perhaps you too can hear their echo, soft, steady, and timeless, guiding us gently toward rest. The story of the Black Death does not end with numbers, nor even with the silence of its passing. It ends, as so many stories do, with memory, quiet, fragile, and enduring. Memory does not shout, it whispers. It lingers in the way a candle flickers in a chapel, in the way a bell tolls softly across a valley, in the way we lean close to one another when fear grows heavy. Centuries have passed since ships drifted silently into Messina, their holds filled with both goods and death. The sailors who coughed beneath tattered sails are long gone. The families who waited on the shore have turned to dust. Yet the echo of their lives remains, a gentle murmur woven into the fabric of history. They are remembered not only in records and chronicles, but in the ways the world shifted because of them. Their quiet endurance became the soil in which our present stands. The rebuilt villages, the widened streets, the new questions asked by scholars, all of these were born from a time when silence seemed absolute. The Black Death reshaped kingdoms and altered the course of faith, but more importantly, it revealed something timeless, that humanity can face even the deepest shadows and still move forward, step by trembling step. When we look back, it is easy to focus on the enormity, the millions lost, the cities emptied, the fear that wrapped itself around the world. But beneath that enormity are the smaller, gentler truths. The mother who sang to her child though she herself was weak. The farmer who planted grain in a deserted field so that others might eat. The priest who stayed by a stranger's side until the last breath. These are the moments that carry the weight of history, the threads of quiet courage that wove a torn world back together. And so the memory remains not as despair, but as reminder. A reminder that silence does not last forever. A reminder that even in grief there is resilience. A reminder that the ordinary people of long ago lived lives that still speak softly to us now. Their world was changed, and so was ours. Tonight, as we close this journey, perhaps you can hear that whisper. It drifts across the centuries like the faint toll of a distant bell. It does not demand, it does not alarm. It simply reminds that life is fragile, that time is precious, that endurance is possible. The Black Death was a storm, but storms pass. What remains are the stories, the memory, the echo, the whisper. Let it guide you now into rest, for the world is quieter when we listen to its memory, and in that quiet we find comfort. The past does not vanish, it becomes part of us, shaping our steps, steadying our hearts, reminding us of the strength that lives in silence. The Black Death changed the world, but the quiet moments it left behind still live on. In history, in memory, in us. And with that, the story fades into stillness, carrying you gently toward sleep.